COOGS House. We're number one. We're number one. We're number one.
You are Locked On Coogs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach, Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by on the number one team in the nation, feel free to subscribe down below. You get the podcast each day in your feed. That way will be your first listen of the day each and every day. We're talking all things Houston Cougars. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. Again, we're getting this thing up and running. We're up over 100 subscribers, so thank you all for that. I actually have on a Marcus Sasser t-shirt today. We're giving away one of a couple different Marcus Sasser t-shirts when we hit 250 subscribers, so make sure you hit subscribe and then comment on videos as well to get in on the action and potentially get one of those shirts as well. If you can't think of some of the comments, the question today is, do you call it Coke, soda, pop, or something else? Make sure you respond to the comments down below. Now, today's episode is all about looking at the fact that Houston is ranked number one in the AP poll for the first time since 1983. 1983 was, sorry for some people out there, a long time ago. So we're going to talk about what that means for the program, what people had to say about that, and kind of look at what that means going forward. That doesn't mean we're going to look past Norfolk State. Norfolk State is the team we're playing. If you listen to this Tuesday night in the Fertitta Center. However, it does kind of supersede that because, frankly, anything that happens to that Norfolk State game will entirely be like covered with the veil of having been the number one team in the country, right? So first things first, we're going to look at like what Sampson said and kind of what he says and how that shapes things for the program. Second segment, we're going to look at like what players said and what some of those guys said and what we kind of glean from what they were saying at practice today after the news was announced. And last but not least, we'll look at kind of like what that means for the rest of the season and kind of how things go from here, right? I mean, the goal is to be the number one team in April. And so considering it is currently, as the time recording this November 28th, this time you're listening to this November 29th, kind of a long way till April. So we're going to look at what that could mean. So Sampson had a number of different things to say about this. First of all, at the end of the Kent State game on Saturday, when it was kind of like hinted at the possibility that Houston was still undefeated and that the number one team, University of North Carolina, had lost, there was like this subtle like, oh, you could be number one. So we had several comments there. And then today, once the news was official and the AP poll came out at about 11:15 local time, Sampson was also asked a few questions after that. And we'll look at what he said there. Now, Sampson, in both instances on Saturday and today, called being number one a rental because truthfully, in most college basketball seasons, being number one is a rental. It's the kind of thing that kind of cycles through a handful of top teams, and you're just hoping you're the team that's holding on to it at the end of the season in early April. And I think it's a really healthy way to go about it because it's not saying like we're not one of those teams cycling through it, but Sampson is pointing out that like, hey, this thing can come and go no matter, like it might be out of our control. It's one of those things. I just got water over my notes. So it's one of those things that will just kind of come and go over the course of the season. Now, I do think that it's also interesting because it's a rental, it kind of takes the onus out of the players and coaches, right? It's like, it's not up to us. We're just going to go win and play basketball games. And if we get to hold on to it, we get to hold on to it. Like it's not the end, not completely up to Houston. I also think it's like worth pointing out that it's not up to Houston because there's a real chance they fall to number 2 or 3 some week without losing, right? Followed behind them, University of Texas at Austin, just up the road, is sitting there at number 2, and UVA is sitting there at number 3. Now, Houston will get to play UVA in a couple weeks, but realistically, like someone could just vote slightly differently next week. even if all three teams were still undefeated, and bump UVA to the top, or they could bump Texas over because of whatever, or both teams, University of Texas and University of Houston, could be undefeated come like mid-January, and someone says, well, I like the Big 12 better, and they just bump them over, right? There's no telling how those kind of things happen, and if you just call it a rental and treat it as such, it's okay. It doesn't impact you, right? I also think that Sampson had one quote in the press conference on Monday, virtual Zoom press conference, that I think sticks out as like really important in my understanding of him. He said, quote, I don't think we're the best team in the nation because we're a work in progress. And I think that harkens this idea that like the goal is not to be the best team on November 29th. The goal is not to be the best team in December 29th or January 29th or February 29th or even March. There's no 29th, but you get my drift, right? The goal is to be the number one team at the end of the season, and the goal is to be the number one team on the floor every time you step on it, right? That's what the goal is. And I think what's interesting here is that Sampson's saying, like, we're not the best team in the nation because we're not as good as we can be. We're a work in progress, and thus we're working towards being that number one team come mid-April, right? Like that, we're trying to be the number one team after the Final Four, play the Energy Stadium just down the road. We're trying to be that number one team. He said he saw a bunch of number one teams play over the weekend. He specifically cited Purdue, Texas, and Connecticut. I think it's interesting. He didn't say Virginia, who Houston will play later this season. He pointed out Texas, who's just up the road, like future conference foe. I guess technically there's potential to overlap with them in the Big 12 for a year. And then he mentioned like Purdue, who, like, if we're looking at top 7 or 8 teams, like, I think gives Houston a real matchup problem. Not here or there. I think those are all intentional picks. He also picked teams that have really good coaches, right? Like Chris Beard at Texas got a really good program. Beard's doing really good things at Texas Tech as well, right? Connecticut has been a strong program with several people coming through, right? I think what's interesting there is that, like, that seems to be the kinds of things that Sampson leans on. Like, he tends to find those kinds of things as he's pointing to this. And last but not least, Sampson was really, really quick to say this is for the fans, right? And this is good for them to, if you're the kind of person, he didn't say he's the kind of person, but if you are the kind of person that's bragging, right? Sampson said, you got him, right? Like, that. This is, go talk to your buddies at the water cooler at work about Houston's number one or whatever, right? The other thing, though, is that he understands the history of this place and this program, right? He was like, they played in front of the University of Houston, played in front of the largest audience to ever watch a college basketball game in the Astrodome, right? Like, that was this U of H. The Phi Slamma Jamma was like a cultural phenomenon, I think was the phrase he used. That was this U of H. It's kind of been a minute. We mentioned it was 1983 was the last time Houston was ranked number one overall in any poll. And that's, what was that, almost 40 years ago? That's a long time. That's a very long time. For reference, if a college basketball player is 20, that's 2 full college basketball player lifetimes ago, right? Like, that's crazy. That's incredible. And it took that long for a bunch of different factors, frankly, in the offseason. Maybe once we win the title and we'll talk about like difference or whatever, and we'll talk about the offseason, we'll talk about like how that kind of like ebbed and flowed or whatever. But truthfully, I think what he's pointing there is that, like, this is a program that has the history of being this kind of place. And this is the kind of program that, like, you can build here. It's been done before. We're just doing it again, right? And that's an important thing when you look at like these mid-major type programs or these smaller schools or schools with smaller sports endowments or like smaller stadiums or venues or not Power 5 conferences or whatever. Houston is has the potential to become those other things. We're moving Big 12 next year, right? That's the whole point. I just thought it was interesting that he tied it to that sort of history. And he did, again, he mentioned it was this like gift for the fans. And speaking of gifts, the holidays are here, and you can achieve gifting greatness when you give the gift of perfectly aged, tender, and delicious Omaha steaks. The steak experts at Omaha Steaks have put together something specially curated for gift packages to help out take the guesswork out of gifting and make your holiday make you a holiday hero. Go to omahasteaks.com and use code Locked On at checkout to get $30 off of your order. You can send an assortment of mouthwatering favorites guaranteed to impress, like the legendary, there's a butcher's cut filet, there's a air chilled boneless chicken, juicy burgers, even super easy to prepare comfort meals that are all ready in a flash. Omaha Steaks is ready to ship your order right away. So shop early and beat the shipping rush. Go to omahasteaks.com, use promo code Locked On at checkout. Omaha Steaks is a gift from the heart. It'll be remembered with every unforgettable bite. Order with complete confidence today, knowing that you're ordering the very best. Visit omahasteaks.com. Use promo code Locked On at checkout to get an extra $30 off your order. Minimum order may be required. Now, I think it's interesting that like Sampson had that to say about this, right? The players, I think it'd be natural to be like, Sampson is a veteran coach. He's been at Power 5 programs. He was at, Wazoo. He was at Oklahoma. He was at Indiana. He's been in the NBA as an assistant coach for a number of different couple of different teams, a number of years. And of course, he's going to have this mature outlook on it, right? But honestly, the dudes in their 20s on the team kind of have some swag. And so like, what would those guys have to say about this? And bluntly, now that it's past us, I would argue that there was some of that nervousness in the game against Kent State back on Saturday, right? Like they struggled in that game. And I think everyone kind of knew going into that game, like if Houston wins, they're number one. And so I think because of that, there was like a couple of like, couple threes fell a little short and those kind of things because like you're a little jerky. But that was not the air or tenor of the team on Monday. And someone's probably coached them up some about like wearing that badge with both pride and honor since then, right? Captain and point guard Jamal Shead said it's something he's going to embrace as a leader of the team, but that it's really for the fans and it's really a recognition of guys before him, right? The Galen Robinsons of the world or Armani Brookses of the world or the guys that kind of built this program earlier in Sampson's tenure kind of had a lot to do with the fact that like Houston's number one right now, because those were all Houston's been to the Final Four in the last couple of years, right? Like it's just 2021, right? Like this is not that long ago. Houston's been in the Elite Eight. Houston's been in the Sweet 16, right? Houston has been building towards being a nationally recognized basketball program for several years now. And frankly, like there's Go Cougs tweeted out screenshots of like the 2013 stadium versus the stadium on Saturday. And like the Sampson effect has been very, very real. Right. But Shed was quick to point out like, listen, this isn't really about the current team. It's about the fans. They can enjoy it. It's about the past guys. This is a recognition of them. It's November 29th. We got work to do. Or it said 28th. We got work to do. Right. Like they got things to take care of. And that's, again, captain and point guard of the team. Coach Sampson always says, like, there are three guys that can't have bad days. That's the coach. That's the point guard. That's the best player. And that's the point guard's mentality about this. As far as the best player's mentality about this, Marcus Sasser, he was like a little bit more like giggly or giddy in his presser. And that's not to say that, like, he wasn't as mature as Jamal Shead. They just have different personalities. Like, Shead is much more focused and serious. And Sasser's like, we're number one. Like, what do you want to tell you? He said that it's a big accomplishment, but it also brings a big target to their backs. And then he talked a lot about how like that's the good thing. The good thing is they now know they have the big target. There's no question mark about the big target anymore, right? Because now they're going to play teams across the country, wherever they're playing, and they know for a fact that as they're playing that team is walking in the gym ready to play the number one team in America. And that brings to Sasser, right? That's a good thing because it like brings the best out of them. It makes them prepare for that as well. He said the funny thing was that in Sasser's, I'm paraphrasing, but in Sasser's words, more or less, it was that, Kelvin Sampson kept it real. They walked in today. Sampson said, talked about, congratulated them on that. And it's like, also, we sucked against Kent State on Saturday. Let's fix these things, right? Like there was just something about moving on from it. And I thought that was a really funny tidbit because, like, that's exactly the kind of mentality that got them to being number one, was like, all right, cool, this is nice, but we have things to fix here. And that's just the way this program is going for 8 years at this point, right? Tramon Mark said that kind of the same similar idea, that like very quickly it was like, hey, congrats, we played Norfolk State Tuesday night and we can't look as bad as we did against Kent State, right? Like, let's get things rolling. I will say in my preliminary research, because I thought about doing a Norfolk State preview podcast. I understand that it sounds silly to say after what just happened against Kent State. I feel like Kent State was a lot better than Norfolk State, and Tuesday night's kind of a warm up game in a lot of ways for St. Mary's of the weekend. And I, knock on wood, I hope that's continues to be that way. But Kent State, I think we're just going to learn, is like going to be a good team and might be a Sweet 16 team if they get the right draw, right? Like that's kind of what that team looked like. But anyway, Tramon Mark was quick to point out, like, coaches moving on to Norfolk State, and I'd imagine Wednesday morning they're moving on to St. Mary's, and I imagine Sunday morning, like, they're just going to keep on keeping on in that kind of a way, right? It's just funny because this is just also, as a matter of fact, Jalen Roberts spoke, and I'm honest, if you're looking at his face when he spoke, big man Jalen Roberts, I wonder if, like, he looked upset, and I don't know to mean that say like he looked angry. I mean, like, he was not like Marcus Sasser had this kind of like giddy feel to him. Roberts was like, no, like, we've got work to do. And I wonder if that's like because he'd been ripped in film sessions or something, because, bluntly, I thought he played fine on Saturday. I said as much in yesterday's episode. I do think his sub, Reggie Chaney, kind of showed like, hey, I need more minutes. and I wonder if that's kind of falling on his shoulders more than Jarris Walker's shoulders, or if that's just who J1 is, right? Like, if that's just how he's portraying himself. But he, said, quote, "It feels good, but you don't want to go, like, let it go to your head." He said that he did hear from several past guys, which is always interesting because, like, several people mentioned how this program has been building to this point because of the efforts of past generations or past iterations of the U of H basketball program. And he mentioned, like, no, I've heard from those guys, right? DeJaren and Galen and those guys have all reached out to guys like Roberts that have been on the team kind of with them, some of the overlap. And that's important to me, like the idea that, like, Quentin Grimes out there tweeting about it and that kind of stuff, like, that's big time, because that is where the program says it started with those guys, and those guys are like, yeah, it did. Right? Like, that's the back and forth of reciprocality. It's also just cool to see, right? Like, Galen's playing in France right now and saying how, like, proud he is of the program, that he was, like, so instrumental in building, is really, really cool to see. Armani's bounced around the G League a little bit, like, seeing him being proud is really, really cool to see. Fabian, at last I saw, was playing with, he was in a two-way kind of deal with the Lakers, right? It's good to see Fabian White out there talking about being proud of the program and, like, cheering on the U of H from afar. And that's just all really, really important. But I think as moving to the third segment here, we've got to look at, like, what that word rental, to steal Sampson's word, means, and kind of what this means for the program as a whole, right? So first of all, I think it's important to note that, like, until there's no undefeated team left, presumably then one team's going to be defeated. That means that, like, Houston, if they were to drop one to Norfolk State tonight after we record this, or if they were to drop one to St. Mary's next weekend, or Alabama on the 10th, or Virginia on the 17th, or, McNeese State on the 21st, whoever that they lose to, theoretically, it would knock them out of the spot, right? So, like, a loss would probably knock you out of the spot and just kind of start the cycle over until there's eventually no undefeated teams, and then you start weighing losses and wins and those kinds of things, right? I also think that there's an important aspect to this word rental that is worth noting, that, like, I'm not going to go through the whole slate of games on December 17th, but number one Houston plays currently number 3 Virginia on December 17th at 1:00 in Charlottesville, Virginia. And that's not the only matchup of current top 10 teams that day, right? Like theoretically, Houston could struggle and beat Virginia, but you could have like Ohio State demolish Purdue or something and just not look the best that week, right? And theoretically, like you could remain undefeated, but that rental is up because someone else looked better, even though you're undefeated. And so, like, that goes to that idea that like this is not entirely up to the University of Houston. In a lot of ways, it could come down to things beyond their control. Like Houston has no control over how Purdue plays, over how Texas plays, over how Connecticut plays, over how any of these teams play. But they have control over how U of H plays, and they're going to continue to control that as best they can for a long time. And that is, I think, the focus there. I also think it's interesting that, like, in looking at like how this plays out, like when could this go away? I mentioned December 17th as A, the most difficult game of the schedule as it stands, and B, as like a day where there's a bunch of other stuff happening in college basketball, right? So like not only is that a big day for college basketball, but it's also kind of this transition out of like after that you have like the New Year's Six bowl games and like the college football playoff, and outside of that, you're more or less wrapping up college football season. Like people that are paying attention to college sports are really focused on basketball, more or less starting this weekend, right? Like you have conference championship Saturday, and like starting Sunday, it's like, all right, I'll watch like a couple bowl games, New Year's Day, college football playoff, boom, college basketball, right? Being number one at that point in the season means that like that's a lot of people's first impression of you is that one next to your name, and that one is next to the Cougs name, right? Like that's really, really important. And that's an honor and a privilege, right? But it's also the kind of thing that like means that when we're talking about seeding later this season, if Houston has the kind of season we're hoping to have, most of those people that are like looking at like how things will go, not necessarily to say the people that like make the bracket or the NCAA tournament itself, but like people would be expecting, right? They'll know like that Houston has a high seed because they've been number one at the right time of the year. It also means that if you start playing poorly after that, it's kind of the thing. It's like, oh, look at the fall from grace from the Cougs, right? Like, oh, they started out like, remember when they were number one and like they lost to South Florida and Cincinnati in the same week or whatever, right? Like, oh my God. Right? And so that's the kind of like thing that could come with that. As far as when this thing could go away, we mentioned this December 17th with Virginia Day. They play Alabama the week before that on the 10th. That's at 2:00 in the afternoon. That's actually here in Houston, so that's nice. I do think that. Okay, I'll be honest with you. I think St. Mary's on Saturday, and I previewed a couple different times, and you'll hear Thursday's episode. I actually had on Zach Farmer, who covers them. I got to go on his podcast over the weekend, and we talked a little bit about the game as well. I think Houston, unless they come out as flat as they did against Kent State, could come out pretty scarless. I think that what's interesting to get the Kent State game is hearing more and more about like how illness kind of went through the team and what kind of an impact that had on that game. And it feels like if that's really in the past for everyone, except it sounds like Ramon Walker is still feeling a little bit, but if they really got that behind them, I think St. Mary's will be kind of game in Fort Worth. Should be a fun time. Alabama on the 10th. Alabama was good, but I think Houston's better. We'll talk about that in preview as we get there. Virginia's going to be tough. I said it. Virginia's going to be tough. Then we get into conference play pretty quickly. And if they were to beat Alabama or Virginia within conference play, like road trips are hard. So like SMU be hostile, Cincinnati be hostile. Ending the season at Memphis in March is rough. And there's a real chance that like if you hadn't lost yet going into that game, that place is raucous. That could be rough. But man, like this is looking like the kind of schedule that's really working in Houston's favor. And the only like asterisk I'll put on that, and that's probably where I'll leave it, is that like having a favorable schedule and being the number one team in the country means the potential you had a chance to do something really, really incredible. It is not lost on me that in the exact same season as those kinds of things breaking our way, we also have the Final Four being played in the city of Houston. Not lost on me, right? It is not lost on me that there's a real chance that there's like 2 top 15 picks in the NBA draft on this basketball team. That is not lost on me. But all of that is just potential things. And potential is something that you've got to go do. Potential is nothing. Potential is just the chance to do something. And so Houston is number one in the team in the country. They got the potential to do something really, really great. But that means they got to go do it, right? And it starts tonight. We play Norfolk State, so it starts tonight. It continues this weekend with St. Mary's, and it continues all the way up through mid-April. And when we're having the parade through town, and we're turning on Holman, or maybe it'll be on Cullen. I don't know. But we're going through campus and we're cheering them on. First of all, I hope we're cheering on the volleyball team in a couple weeks as well. And so hopefully it's only the second parade of the season, of the year. But like, man, they've got a chance, and it's nice to know that other people see it. But it also means that we've just got a chance, and we've got to go do it. Happy about it. Happy to talk about it. Can't wait to cover the Cougs all season long. Feel like, frankly, pretty privileged that Locked On has trusted me to do this season of all seasons. So thank you guys at Locked On. If anyone out there is listening to this, thank you so much for listening as well. Make sure you talk with me all about the Cougs all the time. You find me at Painsworth512, Painsworth 512 on Twitter, Instagram, all the social media handles. I'll be happy to talk all things Cougs, all things being number one, all things. The Rockets dropped a tough one to Denver after a couple wins in a row, but we can talk all things them as well. The Astros just signed Jose Abreu, and that feels big. We talk about that as well. We're going to a bowl game, so we'll be able to talk about that in a couple weeks once we figure those kinds of things out. Thank you all so much for tuning in and making Locked On Coogs your first listen of the day. If you're looking for a second listen, I'm going to recommend Locked On Astros because of that key free agent signing I just mentioned. If you're looking for a third, fourth, and fifth listen, obviously make sure you subscribe to the channel and download Locked On Coogs each and every day for the latest on the Cougs all year long. Locked On Coogs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Go Cougs. Number one.